Series this summer of studying these two women, Ruth and then Esther, these two women who seem to be in a time where God appears to be totally silent. 2 weeks ago, we began this second part of our series looking at Esther, which is even more challenging because the people in the book of Esther don't even mention the divine name of the Lord. Yahweh is not even mentioned by name in this book. What a time where it really does seem like God would be silent. It's a challenging book for us to read in that respect. What is God doing here? And that question is going to be even more pronounced here in a rather bleak and rather terrifying passage of Esther chapter 3. So what we saw last 2 weeks ago in the first two chapters of Esther is the Jewish people. The whole area is under Persian rule, the rule of the Persian Empire of King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, as is known to history. But suddenly, one young Jewish woman, Esther, has gotten this sudden promotion from an exile under Persian rule to the queen alongside King Ahasuerus. And all the while, her cousin Mordecai has been raising her almost like a father, protecting her, guiding her. And he strictly instructed her, don't reveal your Jewish identity, don't reveal your Jewish heritage and religion to anyone. It'll make you even more of an outcast. So cover that up. Because at this time, being a Jew in the Persian Empire is a very vulnerable position. But we're about to see in Esther 3, it is about to go from vulnerable to even more endangered in this passage. At the very end of chapter 2, which we didn't look at last time, but I'll sum up the end of chapter 2, we see Mordecai actually given a very high position. As Esther's promoted, she's able to promote him as well. He becomes an official in the gate of the king's gate. That's almost like an official judge position, this very high established place in the king's gate. And while there, he uncovers an assassin's plot to kill King Ahasuerus. So he intervenes and stops these would-be assassins from killing the king, but he's not really honored quite yet. The king doesn't know that Mordecai has saved him. And all the while, Mordecai, Esther, trying to conceal their Jewish identity, Mordecai will find himself in the middle of another murderous plot. So read with me here, Esther chapter 3, starting in verse 1. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" When they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. They told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast that is, they cast lots before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand, gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also. Do with them as seems good to you." The king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict according to all that Haman commanded was written to the king's satraps, to the governors over all the provinces, to all the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script, and every people in its own language. It is written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th month, day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the capital. And the king and Haman sat down to drink. The city of Susa was thrown into confusion. This is the word of the Lord. You know, when someone tells you that Rome wasn't built in a day, they aren't dropping random trivia about ancient empires and social engineering. They're saying all great things happened by a long series of minuscule, seemingly mundane events. A series of crucial choices by rulers, by generals, by philosophers enshrined the Roman Empire in the minds of all living people today, right? But what's interesting, the phrase Rome wasn't built in a day can also be turned on its head to the negative. Rome did not fall in one day. That is to say, the same is true that Rome didn't fall. Odoacer didn't just wake up in Germany in 476 one day and say, I'm going to knock on the gates of Rome and say I'd like to overthrow the city and sit on the throne. No, it is actually rather disputed whether Rome fell at that moment in 476. Rome fell after a series of chips and cracks worked their way into the very foundation of that empire. Downfalls happen slowly, often unknowingly. And your own personal downfall could happen seemingly in a day, but it begins long before that. Your own personal downfall. And it might call us to question then. As we looked in our confession of sin reading from Numbers of people who turn and rebel, what road were they on? It seems like they were certainly on a road towards destruction, their own destruction. What road are you on today? Are you constantly terrified of a possible impending downfall for you? Some of you might be on a road to destruction, to annihilation, and not even know it yet. Not even be aware. It's a frightening question, isn't it? Am I on a road of a point of no return? But I'm here to tell you today that the gospel shows us that Christ is the only one who saves us from that road of destruction. That Christ, if we turn to him in faith, is the only one who can save us from that impending annihilation and destruction. So let us understand the danger of that. And even in our chapter here in chapter 3, how the annihilation of God, the coming annihilation of God's people seems to come by a series of small little events where pride is challenged, truth is twisted, and power is deferred. All these several different actors create this setting where we land in the confusion at the end of the chapter. Pride being challenged, truth being twisted, power being deferred. So again, while these steps begin that road, only Christ stands to save us. This all indeed begins where one man's immense pride is challenged, is resisted. Haman gets this special promotion at the very beginning in verse 1, right? And he is promoted to be this right-hand man to King Ahasuerus. And you can only expect the unbearable self-importance that someone like Haman must have. There is a law passed demanding that everyone respect and honor this guy, that everyone must bow and pay homage as he comes by. It's very specific, isn't it? And just as we saw with the edict that the king sent out to all the women in the empire, if you have to demand respect by decree, that shows you don't have any respect from anyone. If you have to demand it by official decree, it really shows no one really respects you. There's only one person who stands up to that, though. People might be talking behind their backs at Haman, but only one man stands defiant. Mordecai simply refuses to bow down and pay homage. Why this sudden act of rebellion? We don't really actually get much of insight into Mordecai's thinking. And it's one thing I just want to highlight here. I don't know how much it's in Mordecai's mind, but even just from a biblical, literary perspective, there's a parallel here of who Mordecai is, a son of the tribe of Benjamin, a son of Kish, and Haman, a descendant of Agag. Almost over a year ago, we were in 1 Samuel 15, where King Saul was eventually rejected as king. Why was King Saul rejected? King Saul of the tribe of Benjamin, because he was commanded to kill Agag, king of the Amalekites. And he did it. So Samuel had to take into his own hands a sword, saying to Agag, "As your sword made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. This son of Benjamin, of Saul, didn't kill Agag. And now the descendants, though, of Agag live on, and we get this return of this villain in Haman. And again, this man standing opposed against him. These two people who are now forever, these two peoples who are forever enemies, now we see these descendants face off. That little seed, hundreds of years before, planted, as we see here today. So see those enemies against each other, but it gets worse. As I said, that is kind of a behind-the-scenes reasoning, but we don't hear from Mordecai reasoning. You might read this at first and say, bow down and pay homage. And some would say, that sounds kind of like almost religious language of not just the bowing down. That's just a sign of respect. But even more so, it's always bow down and pay homage here. Is Mordecai refusing on account of his Jewish faith? I mean, his Jewish faith comes at the center here, doesn't it? His faith becomes central here. Is he trying to make like a religious stand here? Of I won't do that because you're not God and only I worship God in that way? Is he making like a first commandment kind of stand? It might be easy to see that at first, but actually Mordecai does the action of paying homage elsewhere in this book. Esther bows down and pays homage elsewhere. Other places throughout the Old Testament, those terms are referred to people doing that to other humans. So culturally, just as in our society we do certain ways of showing respect and bowing or paying homage, it was culturally appropriate for Mordecai to do this. So why, if this is culturally sensitive and not like a breaking of God's commandments, why is he making a stand here? And it's a very important question for us to ask, as he is challenging the pride of Haman. What is he doing? Because this whole time, remember, if this is really about his Jewish faith, remember that he is very specific to Esther. Conceal your Jewish identity. Conceal it. He is not wearing his Judaism on his sleeve, but all of a sudden he's exposing his Jewish people now over this issue. He has told Esther to make all these contextualizations, all these sacrifices, whereas if you know the book of Daniel, it's a very similar kind of setting. And Daniel makes religious stands throughout the whole thing. He won't eat the meat that's sacrificed to idols. He'll only have a vegetarian diet. He won't bow down to the golden statue. He won't do all these things. Esther, on the other hand, Mordecai commands her, no, just go along with the crowd. Don't make stands of your faith. So it seems that Mordecai is not as interested about making a religious stand here. But he's still fighting a battle here. And what comes out is his faith. Why choose to fight the battle now, I ask? Because Mordecai must know he's certainly putting a target on his back from Haman. If Haman didn't know he was disrespected before, he hears it now loud and clear. So, it's funny, as I kind of looked at the kind of lack of respect that Haman gets, I started to realize that Haman really is kind of a Dwight Schrute character in this setting. If you know the American version of The Office show, he really is kind of a Dwight character, and I think it's fitting because I think King Ahasuerus is also kind of a Michael Scott kind of king. I got down a really deep rabbit hole recasting this whole book with Office characters. Because Haman really is grabbing on to this great position of assistant to the regional emperor, right? Everyone now must bow down and pay homage to me. the assistant to the regional emperor. And yeah, there are some yes men who just kind of roll their eyes and be like, fine, we'll bow down, get on, go prostrate when he walks by us. But Mordecai just kind of mugs the camera and then says, no, I'm not doing that. Haman's the worst. I think Mordecai's strong dislike of Haman comes out here, and he's making a stand. And it might appear as if he's making the stand for God, but really it might be a stand for himself and his own distaste for Haman. I think it is, though, this is kind of hard to walk this line, though, because I want us to, like in the book of Daniel, I think it is important as we are exiles in a unchristian land many times. It's important for us to make stands for what Christ says to us in his word and stand by how different our moral values are from the rest of culture. But when do we fight those battles? When do we make those stands? And what is our tone as we do it? I think that becomes very important. Because Daniel, as we see in that book, he makes these stands very clearly what his convictions are, and not in a way that creates immediate conflict and disrespect of others. Mordecai, on the other hand, is a little bit murkier. When you make a stand for Christ, are you doing it because it really is founded in Scripture that you must follow this thing, or are you just using it as an opportunity to show your distaste for others, show your distaste for someone else's thought process? Are you just using your opportunity to make this grandstanding moment to show how much holier and moral you are? It's a very difficult line to walk. That we can make a stand for our moral convictions and make them clear, also not doing it in a way that's grandstanding and doing it in a way that is proud and prideful. There's a humble way to do it. I'm not going to spend the rest of the time in Daniel, but I do think if you go through the first couple of chapters of Daniel, you'll see a very helpful contrast for us of how to live in a way that makes stands for what God has called us to do without actually making it be about our pride and our desire. I do want to make it clear, though, as we shift on, the Jewish people still do not deserve what happens next. It is not Mordecai's fault that this annihilation comes down upon the Jews. That's not it at all, but we just are kind of tracing these small little steps that once the pride of Haman is challenged, it works more and more sin into his heart, that he doesn't want to just kill Mordecai. Haman's eyes, it says, find it despicable to lay hands on Mordecai. Instead, if he just kills one man, Haman's a murderer. But he wants his revenge to be greater than that. He wants to annihilate all the Jews, exterminate all Jews from the empire. Remember last week when I said that this story is rather comical at times? Things in this comedy of errors have just gotten a lot darker, haven't they? It's become a lot more terrifying. That one man's ego is bruised, and it wakens in him a genocidal plot. And to carry out this great act of genocide, it begins with some twisting of truth. Twisting of the truth of the humanity in the Jewish people. He's ripping that away and twisting and breaking that away, becoming a lie to the image of God that is bestowed on them. His pride offense, the offense to his pride, turns slowly into this hatred towards genocide. And Haman bides his time, slowly by slowly, plotting his revenge against Mordecai and all the Jews. He's not going to throw open the doors to the king's chamber and shout out, I'm going to kill all the Jews. No, he has to wait until he's called. We'll see later how important it is to wait until you're called by the king. The ironic humor here of the great overreactions of the people here has turned to a sour bite. It's almost as if this one man is offended by one other person and wants to kill his entire people. It's as if, can you imagine if historians discovered Adolf Hitler's whole motivation for the Holocaust? And imagine if they uncovered his whole motivation for the Holocaust originated from a rival Jewish painter who was just a little bit better than him in art school. It would be bizarre. No one thinks like that, where just one person upsets you and you say, I'm going to kill your whole race. It's bizarre. It's astounding. But as we're saying, what are the subtle steps towards sinful annihilation. It begins in these subtle ways where we let sin fester in our hearts in a way that twists and distorts and perverts truth to the point of violence and hatred. That twisting away of the image of God of others. It's really quite horrifying, isn't it? Haman knows he must refine his bloodlust pitch. He must put it in the most politically correct terms as possible. He must get this political power without, sounding too passionate, with putting it in the right terms to convince the king. And so he says in verse 8, as he sells this plot to the king, Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among all the peoples and all the provinces of your kingdom. Their custom, their laws are different from those of every people. They do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them." So pay attention to what he doesn't say. What does he not mention? Who the people are. No mention of the Jewish people are mentioned. No mention of what laws they break are brought out there. He's keeping it very vague about this certain shadowy group behind all the things. No mention of their problematic beliefs. He keeps things just enough in the dark to get the king's approval by twisting the truth. One commentator I read this past week that I really liked how she put it said that Haman's plot contains truth, half-truth, and lies. Truth, half-truth, and lies. There is truth that, yes, the Jewish people did have their own laws that they were allowed to follow. But, guys, that was like the whole big thing in the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire allowed Jews to go back to Judah. They allowed them to worship their own gods. There's a bit more freedom in the Persian Empire. So that's true. But the twisting of the truth, the half-truth, is that they break all the other king's laws. Yeah, Mordecai disobeys one command, right? And now he's painted the entire Jewish people with that same slight. The outright lies that go into this. And what is the last thing that he really uses to sell? It's profitable to kill them. It is not to your profit, king, to tolerate them, to permit them to live. And if I execute this plan, just give me 10,000, and I will hire people to do this by that price. And all the wealth, once we plunder the people, you get some of the proceeds too. It's a win-win-win for you, King Ahasuerus. You're going to turn out great if you just let me take charge. It's a very, like I said, dispassionate. His hatred doesn't come out here. He just says, you know what? It's expensive running an empire. Here's a way to save a few thousand coins here. Haman's way, that cold, distant way of presenting his mad genocidal plan reminded me of a film from many years back. The film, it's named Conspiracy. And it's a rather horrifying movie because it is a dramatic reenactment of a transcript of a meeting. Horrifying? Yes. It's a dramatic reenactment of the transcript of the Wannsee Conference in 1942 Germany. What happened at this Wannsee Conference in Germany during World War II, it was a secret gathering of top Nazi officials who were commissioned to finalize the details of the final solution of the Jewish question. The men in this meeting analyzed the difficulty that they faced. They had all these Jews that they had put into ghettos and forced out of the land of Germany, but they realized, we're going to conquer the world, and then these Jews we've sent to other countries, we're just going to inherit them again. So what do we do with this problem? And it was at this point, in this conference in Wannsee, that the plan of no longer evacuating Jews, but exterminating them was presented to top officials. These plans that were already in work, already in place, were presented. The plans of gas chambers the Jews themselves would be forced to build, where they would be murdered in. And now, why I found this film so important is that it is the word-for-word telling of what happened at this meeting. And you hear, as these actors interpret the tone of this transcript, is the cold, clinical, and frankly bureaucratic way they discuss one of the greatest human atrocities ever committed. There's hatred behind their words. Yes, the way they talk about the Jews, it's certainly filled with hatred, but it's not in a passionate way. It's almost like, in their minds, a scientific way. And the whole time, they're sipping wine, they're lighting up cigars, indulging on food. Some of the men there are even kind of sickened and horrified when they're talking about the details of this, but they blame it on bad cigars or too much wine, so they don't appear to be negative on these plans presented. And even though they're greatly disturbed by what they're talking about, the camera at the end goes around the table of these dozen or so men, and each one not only gives their approval, but their endorsement of what has been presented. This plan that would claim millions of lives. It depicts, and why it was so stirring for me as I was going over this text again, is that's how evil has its way. Not in this dark, shadowy room of mustache-twirling evil villains, but people who speak, not naming evil as such, but who see evil as just business as usual. When evil and the twisting of truth becomes so mundane to you, so accepted in your thoughts, feelings, and words, those great atrocities then just become an appeal to the bottom line for the sake of efficiency. The easiest, the cleanest way of life. That's all that becomes attractive of great evil. Once truth, once good has become so twisted in our hearts, we no longer desire for what's good, but no matter if it's evil, what if it brings us the easiest, cleanest way of life? The greatest of all human evils begin that same way that sin works in my heart and your heart. Calling for ease, calling to defer your duty, to do the highest good, all for the sake of profit. You see, King Ahasuerus was so surrounded by men of this kind of thinking. His counsel was so filled with wickedness. That's all he was letting go into his ear, the twisting of lies and mistruth, that he didn't even question it, not for a minute. So I want you to know the danger of welcoming those subtle lies of evil even into your heart. Open your eyes to see the way truth can be twisted, and you can, without realizing it, welcome it in there. Because when that happens, we begin to defer our judgment, can defer our power for someone else to carry out great evil. And so we see Ahasuerus' complicity in this as he hands over the signet ring to Haman. So as Haman finishes this bureaucratic, genocidal pitch of, hey, don't worry, we'll pad the bottom line. Our budget will look good at the end of this. What does the king and all of his great wisdom do? The king took off his signet ring from his hand, gave it to Haman the Agagite, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. In the end, King Ahasuerus says, all right, I'll delegate. You go ahead and do it. Handing all power, all discernment, all wisdom over to Haman. Doesn't ask further questions. Any follow-up? Okay, what kind of people are we talking about here? Money? Doesn't matter. He stops listening as soon as he hears the word prophet. Again, we see the king just moved by the first good idea he hears. Does he think of himself or just use his power of endless delegation? I think it's important for us to consider then. Who do we defer power to? Who do we defer our responsibility to? I'm not talking about deferring as like a duty of kindness or courtesy, right? No, it's letting go of when you are responsible, but rather just take the easier road and let someone else do it. One that doesn't tax you. I think of how we so often defer our power of critical thinking, where we just let information that appears on our phone, that's fed to us by our algorithms, that's just constructed for us. We just take it in without thinking further of, does this square up with what God's word says? Or should I just follow along with others? We have a responsibility to investigate together as Christians, hold it up to the word of God, whether this is the right way of living or not. Just letting whatever our news feed feeds us is taking away our power to evaluate and decide. You might not even realize you're deferring in those moments. We also might defer our power of responsibility here. And that can be even just as simple as deferring to our elected leaders, thinking, I don't have to do anything, it's just their job to figure it out. They'll take all the action. It might be deferring to others in the church of, they're serving, so I don't really have to do anything. Even though I'm gifted, I'm not going to listen to anyone to figure out if I'm called to really serve alongside. How long will you sit idle, deferring your responsibility, your calling for someone else to do it. Whether it be raising the discipline for children or outsourcing that to teachers or even your spouse just to do all the work for you. We cannot always let things just be deferred to someone else, because that is just another way that sin goes by unchecked. When we don't even give the moment to think for a moment, what is God asking of me here? And so our passage here ends with both celebration and confusion, doesn't it? Ends with this really sickening note. All the Jews, young and old, women and children, all in one day to be exterminated. The whole capital, it says, of Susa hears word of this plan. And what does the author of this final solution do? Haman sits down with the king, opens up some wine, toasts to health and wealth, to the end of the Jewish people. We see now where the road of annihilation, of downfall, mass murder, total destruction begins. But it also leads here with a note of confusion, despair, all while those who planned it toast to its success. It's a terrifying end of the scene, but it should also call us personally to consider, where are we on that road? Where have we been on that road of destruction, of extermination? Because that is what sin would have its way to do. Satan himself had so grabbed a hold of Haman that sounded like a wonderful opportunity to toast to health and wealth, right? I have to say here, as we kind of turn to our convictions here and where Christ shows up for us, my real love for the book of Esther began in college in my Hebrew class, where my pastor and professor, Dr. Ian Duguid, walked us through this. And it's actually in his book on the book of Esther that I thought, really helped even show me this beautiful picture of where Christ shows up in this chapter. So I wanted to give my verbal little footnote for you there. Because yes, Mordecai and the Jewish people don't deserve this threat that's coming to them. Yes, Mordecai, stands up and rebels against Haman. But Haman's just another man. But what sin is in my life and your life is a refusal to bow down and worship to the feet of our Creator, the one who does deserve our worship. In our sin and our rebellion, we truly did break the King's law, King Yahweh. And our sin is to defer to our pleasures, our ease, our comfort, our desire to defer, to welcome in evil and its twisting of the truth, twisting into lies. And that leads us to a path of eternal destruction in hell. And that is what we've earned for ourselves on our road of sin. Consider those ways and really consider what sin does in paving a road of annihilation. By pride, desperately seeking the affirmation and well-being of others. Feeling such contempt or outrage that Haman has when your pride isn't fed the way you want it. Taking a stand only to realize eventually you are just standing on the wrong side, standing on the side of your selfish pride. All the ways that we continue to defer away from our calling to follow Christ, but instead walk towards that destruction. But praise God that we have a Savior who did not defer his calling to save us. That he truly stood at the right time, taking our humanity that we had twisted and yet redeemed it by becoming man and dying on the cross. Everything that we had so twisted, that we had begun on our road, continued towards self-annihilation. Christ walked that road to Calvary that should have been ours, so that he would take on our punishment, our road, everything that we deserved. That Christ was not destroyed, not annihilated, but found victory and conquering over that twisting and evil that is in our hearts. Cast it out completely. That is where true power is found, where true victory is found, where truth is truly found and beheld. When we confess and realize our own rebellion and the answer in the gospel to be saved from it. I have to realize of Our world today is constantly afraid of coming annihilation. There's a growing sentiment in modern Western culture of truly anti-natalism, of a fear and resistance to having children, of how can I bring children into a world that's so messed up, so on the way to destruction. That a lot of people in our society are really looking at the world and saying, I don't want to see the human race continue. It's a real sentiment. As crises of climate change appear every day with wildfires, floods, record-shattering heat across Europe, people and deadly virus still ravages all the nations. Inflation, cost of living. People are wondering, how should we continue to live on? Maybe we should just die out. It's a real thought that people in our world are having today. Maybe it's crossed your mind before. Of what is the future of the human race even now? As we just stare in the face of disasters and disasters. It's a terrifying thought. It's the thought that's around us. You may not be as concerned for the human race, but you might be facing more personal, existential threats of dread. You might be experiencing that confusion at a personal level that we see in our text today. Or even alternatively, you might not even see it yet. You might not even know the road you're on now. The gospel shouts out through that confusion, that despair, and gives purpose and meaning of the world we're in. That even though for the Jews at the end of this passage they think our whole people are going to die, we will see next week and the week after throughout Esther that God has not forsaken his people. So if you feel in the midst of despair and wondering how this destruction can be avoided, not just for the human race, but you're wondering for your own personal life, there is an answer. That God does not abandon his people. That God does not forsake his people. There is hope in redemption because only Christ, though, is their hope. Only Christ can we have hope for the day to be saved, for your life to be taken off that road to destruction and be put on the road to salvation. So let's turn in prayer then. Take a few moments reflecting on how we need to every day more and more turn in faith to Christ. Let's pray.